$200? Seriously, Brandon. My brother Marcus laughed loudly, his voice echoing through the bank lobby as if I had told the best joke in the world. What kind of 35-year-old man needs to beg for a measly $200? I stood in the middle of Oakwood Trust Bank, feeling the weight of the other customers' curious stares. Marcus stood behind the manager's desk, his impeccable suit and navy blue tie screaming authority, while I wore my plain jacket and faded jeans. The cruel smile on his face was the same one he had when we were kids, and he would break my toys just to see me cry. My name is Brandon, and at 35, I never imagined I would be publicly humiliated by my own brother for asking for a $200 loan. But the situation was desperate. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Martha, needed emergency surgery and was $50 short of paying for her post-operative medications. She had been more of a mother to me than my own family ever was. "Look, everyone," Marcus announced to the entire bank, gesturing like a circus ringmaster, "my failed little brother came here to beg for crumbs. Are you sure you have an account here, Brandon? Because based on your history..." Low laughter began to spread through the room. A gray-haired lady shook her head pityingly. A young man in a suit discreetly filmed with his cell phone. I kept my expression neutral, even though I could feel the blood boiling in my veins. Marcus had always been like this, the golden child, the successful one, the one my parents showed off at family gatherings like a shiny trophy. I was just Brandon, the younger brother who could never find his place in life, as my father used to say. "Marcus," I tried to keep my voice calm, "it's just a simple loan. Can you sue or not?" "Of course I can sue," he leaned on the counter, his eyes gleaming with malice. "But first I need to check if you can really pay it back. What's your profession again?" "Oh, that's right, you work with computers, right? What an impressive title." More laughter. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while he managed loans of a few $1,000s as if he were king of the world, I controlled a digital empire worth $3.8 billion. Over the past 15 years, while they treated me like the family failure, I had quietly built the largest cryptocurrency and emerging technology investment fund on the West Coast. But at that moment, standing in the middle of that bank being humiliated over $200, I decided it was time for my family to find out exactly who Brandon really was. If you're enjoying this twist in the tale, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how this humiliation turned into the biggest financial shock that bank had ever seen. What Marcus didn't realize as he savored his small victory was that I was already mentally calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to turn his smug smile into pure terror. As Marcus continued his performance for the bank audience, memories of our childhood began to come together in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I could finally put together. Marcus had always been the golden child. At 15, when I was 12, he was already driving our father's car to impress the girls at school. I stayed home studying programming on a used computer I had bought with money I had saved from mowing lawns. "Look, Brandon's playing with his machines again," Marcus would tease during family dinners. "Dad, don't you think he should be doing something more normal? Like sports?" Our father, Richard, would always nod in agreement, his approval pouring over Marcus like honey. "Your brother has a point, son. Computers won't teach you how to be a real man." While Marcus received a new car on his 16th birthday, I got a used dress shirt and a lecture on financial responsibility. No one noticed that I had used my programming skills to earn $500 fixing the inventory system at the local hardware store. Now, at 35, nothing had changed. Marcus gestured theatrically to the bank customers, his voice laden with familiar condescension. "You know how it is, right? There's always that brother in the family who can never settle down. Lives alone, no family of his own, works in... What is it you do, Brandon?" The question was a sharp knife, designed to cut deep. Because Marcus knew exactly what I did. Or at least, he knew the version I had told my family. "Technology consulting," I replied calmly, the same vague answer I had given for years. "Oh yes, consulting," he laughed, making quotation marks in the air with his fingers. "What a sophisticated title for 'I fix computers at home.' And how much do you earn from this, consulting?" It was a question he would never have asked if he had known that my consulting had generated more revenue in the last month than he would earn in 50 years as a bank manager. The other customers began to disperse, clearly uncomfortable with the scene. A young mother with a baby in her arms shook her head and left. A middle-aged man muttered something about lack of professionalism as he headed for another cashier. Marcus didn't care. He was having too much fun. You know what's funny, he continued, leaning on the counter as if he owned the place. Mom called me last week, worried about you. She said you didn't even show up at the last family barbecue. Could it be because you don't even have enough money to buy a beer? The truth was that I had missed the barbecue because I was at an investor conference in San Francisco, finalizing a $200 million deal. But Marcus didn't know that. No one in the family did. Or maybe, he lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, you're embarrassed to show up empty-handed again? I remember when you showed up at Dad's birthday party with that handmade card. How embarrassing. That card had taken me 3 hours to make. I had written a poem about all the lessons our father had taught me, illustrated with drawings of moments we had shared. Our father had looked at it for 2 seconds before folding it up and putting it in the mail pile. Marcus had arrived 20 minutes late with a bottle of expensive whiskey, receiving hugs and compliments for being so thoughtful. Marcus, I tried again. Can you process the loan or not? Of course I can, he smiled, but made no move toward the computer. But first I need to check a few things. Do you have a guarantor? Any collateral? Because from what I see in your history here. He clicked a few keys dramatically, frowning as if reading something troubling. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. He was lying, of course. My Oakwood Trust account had a paltry balance, just a few $1,000s that I kept for everyday expenses. My real wealth was spread across a complex network of offshore funds, cryptocurrency investments, and corporate holdings that made it impossible to trace my actual fortune. It was intentional. For years, I had carefully constructed a facade of financial mediocrity specifically for moments like this. The problem is, Marcus continued, clearly savoring each word, that loans are based on trust. And honestly, Brandon, what kind of trust have you inspired over the years? It was at that moment that I realized something had fundamentally changed between us. It was no longer just typical sibling rivalry or our parents' favoritism. It was pure, distilled, intentional cruelty. Marcus had transformed into someone who genuinely enjoyed causing pain. I'm going to do you a favor, he announced, as if he were some kind of magnanimous benefactor. I'll process your loan, for $250. 20% interest. Payment in 30 days. The terms were absurd. Illegal, in fact. 20% interest on a 30-day personal loan equaled an annual rate of over 240%. But he knew I was desperate. He knew Mrs. Martha needed the money today. And he knew I would probably accept anything to get out of there. What Marcus didn't know was that while he was orchestrating his little show of power, I was mentally reviewing the acquisition documents I had signed 6 months ago. Documents that made Oakwood Trust Bank a wholly owned subsidiary of my investment fund. Technically, Marcus wasn't just my younger brother. He was my employee. And in the next 24 hours, he would find out exactly what that meant. All right, Marcus, I replied calmly, watching the victorious smile spread across his face. I accept the terms. He blinked, clearly expecting an outburst or at least an argument. When neither happened, his expression changed to something between disappointment and suspicion. Seriously? He asked, leaning forward. You're going to accept 20% interest on a $200 loan? That's over $40 in interest alone, Brandon. In 1 month. I understand the math, I replied, keeping my voice even. Can you prepare the paperwork? What he didn't know was that as he spoke, I was mentally calculating how much it would cost to buy the entire bank. Not just Oakwood Trust, but the entire corporate chain above it. It would be like buying a cup of coffee, insignificant. Marcus gestured to his assistant, a young woman named Jessica who had watched the entire humiliation with visible discomfort. Jess, prepare a personal loan agreement for my brother here. 250, 20% interest, 30-day term. Jessica hesitated. Mr. Holloway, that interest rate is above the legal limits for personal loans in the state of Ohio. I can't process that. Marcus's face darkened. I'm the manager here, Jessica. You do what I tell you. But banking regulations. Regulations are my problem, he cut her off, his voice rising a notch. You just type what I tell you. I watched this exchange with growing interest. Marcus wasn't just being cruel to me, he was willing to break federal laws to satisfy his ego. That was valuable information. Jessica looked at me with pity before reluctantly turning to the computer. I'm going to need you to sign some additional waiver documents, she murmured. As she prepared the papers, Marcus turned to me with that predatory smile I had known since childhood. You know, Brandon, I always wondered when you would finally grow up and take responsibility for your life. Guess now you have no choice. His words took me back to the last family reunion 3 months ago. I had arrived at our parents' wedding anniversary with a gift that had taken weeks to create, a digitized photo album with decades of family memories, each image restored and captioned by hand. Marcus had arrived with a bouquet of flowers from the supermarket, clearly purchased on the way. Oh, how lovely, Brandon, my mother had said, quickly flipping through the album before setting it aside. You've always been so creative. Later, when I thought no one was listening, I overheard Marcus talking to our cousin Derek in the backyard. Poor Brandon, he had said, taking a sip of beer. 35 years old and still trying to impress his parents with elementary school projects. When will he understand that real work doesn't involve sitting at home playing on the computer? Derek had laughed. At least he tries. Trying doesn't pay the bills, Marcus replied. Dad should have been tougher on him when we were little. Now it's too late. At that moment, sitting on my parents' patio listening to my own brother describe me as a failure, something crystallized inside me. It wasn't anger. Anger was a hot, impulsive emotion. It was something colder, more calculated. It was the decision that I would never again allow my family to underestimate me. Now, 3 months later, as Marcus savored his little show of power, I was mentally reviewing the documents I had studied the night before. Oakwood Trust Bank had been acquired by Meridian Financial Group in 2022. Meridian, in turn, was a subsidiary of Continental Holdings, which was controlled by the Phoenix Investment Consortium. And the Phoenix Investment Consortium had been quietly bought out by my fund, Quantum Dynamics, in a $5.3 billion transaction just 6 months ago. Marcus was lending me my own money, with a legal interest. Here, Jessica announced, sliding a stack of papers across the table. You need to sign at the red marks. As I signed each document, Marcus continued his performance. I hope this teaches you something about financial planning, he said, leaning on the counter like a condescending teacher. Maybe now you'll understand why our family has always worried about you. Our family, I repeated, signing the last page. Interesting that you mention that. Why? No reason, I replied, handing the papers back to Jessica. I just thought it was interesting. Marcus frowned, clearly disturbed by my calmness. He had expected tears, anger, some emotional reaction that would justify his cruelty. My serenity was beginning to bother him. Are you going to be able to pay this back in 30 days? He asked, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. Of course. How? What exactly is your financial situation, Brandon? Because honestly, I've never understood what you do for a living. It was a question I had been expecting for years. The question that would give me the perfect opening for what was to come. Consulting, I replied simply. I work with digital investments. Digital investments, he repeated, making air quotes. What kind of investments? Bitcoin? Day trading? Those pyramid schemes that are always in the media. Each word was a small knife, designed to cut. He was systematically trying to destroy my credibility in front of the entire bank branch. Something like that, I agreed, picking up the money Jessica had counted out on the counter. Brandon, Marcus said, his voice taking on a falsely concerned tone, you need to understand that this fantasy life you've created, it's not sustainable. One day you're going to have to face reality. I put the money in my pocket, looking my brother in the eye for the first time since the conversation had begun. You're right, I said calmly. One of us is definitely going to have to face reality very soon. Something in my voice must have alerted him, because for a moment, just a moment, I saw a shadow of uncertainty cross his face. But then the arrogant smile returned. Well, I hope you learned something from this, he said, extending his hand as if he were doing me a monumental favor. And Brandon? Next time you need money, maybe try getting a real job first. I shook his hand, feeling the firm grip he used to demonstrate dominance. It was the same grip he had used to crush my confidence when we were kids. Thanks for the advice, Marcus, I replied. I'll definitely consider it. As I walked toward the exit, I heard him talking to Jessica in a low voice. Poor Brandon. He's always been a bit lost, you know? Our parents tried to help, but I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. I had heard variations of the same conversation for decades. But as I pushed open the bank door and felt the cold October air against my face, a sense of absolute calm washed over me. For 35 years, I had allowed my family to define me by their own limited standards. I had accepted the role of the failed brother, the disappointing son, the man who would never be able to establish himself properly. But that was the last time. As I drove to Mrs. Martha's house, my phone rang. It was her frail voice laden with concern. "Brandon, dear, did you get the money? The technician is here and said that if I don't pay today, he can't come back until Monday." "I'm on my way, Mrs. Martha," I replied. "And don't worry. After today, you'll never have to worry about money again." It wasn't just about the $200 for the heater. It wasn't even about the humiliation at the bank. It was about breaking a 35-year-old pattern. And in the process, Marcus would find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person for too long. What he didn't know as he savored his victory was that in less than 24 hours, he would be unemployed. And in less than 48 hours, he would discover that the man he had humiliated over $200 was the owner of the bank where he had worked for the past 7 years. Mrs. Martha greeted me at the door with that warm smile that had brightened my darkest days for years. At 78, she still insisted on offering me homemade cookies every time I showed up. "Brandon, dear, you're an angel," she said, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Mrs. Martha," I replied, handing her the money, "you've already repaid me 1,000 times over. Remember when I had pneumonia last year? You spent 3 days taking care of me." Her eyes filled with tears. "Family is family, dear. And you are more family to me than many blood relatives." As she paid the technician and I helped test the new heater, a strange calm came over me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about finally recognizing who really mattered in my life. Mrs. Martha had taken me in when my own parents rejected me. She celebrated my small victories when Marcus ridiculed them. She saw me for who I really was, not as a disappointment or a failure. "Brandon," she said, pouring tea into their delicate porcelain cups, "you seem different today. More peaceful." "I'm making some important decisions," I replied. "Decisions I should have made a long time ago." That night, back at my apartment, I called my personal attorney, Jonathan Crawford. Jonathan had been my legal advisor for 8 years, one of the few people who knew my true financial situation. "Brandon," his voice sounded concerned over the phone. "Are you sure about this? Revealing your identity to your family could have consequences you don't foresee." "Jonathan, for 8 years I kept this secret because I thought I was protecting something valuable. But today I discovered that I was protecting people who despise me." "What about Marcus specifically?" "He's your brother." "He ceased to be my brother the moment he decided to publicly humiliate me for fun," I replied, feeling a coldness in my own voice. "I need you to prepare the documents. I want an emergency meeting with the Oakwood Trust Bank Board tomorrow at 9 a.m. "What kind of meeting?" "A compliance audit. I want to review all of Marcus's branch's lending practices, especially those from the last year." There was a long pause. "Brandon, this is going to cause a lot of noise. If they find any irregularities." "Jonathan, I loaned $200 today at 20% interest in 30 days. Processed by the branch manager himself. If that's not an irregularity, I don't know what is." "My God," he muttered. "He really did that. In front of a branch full of customers. And I recorded it all." The next morning came sooner than I expected. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I was nervous, but because I had finally found a clear purpose after years of drifting. While I was having coffee, my phone rang. It was Marcus. "Brandon, brother," his voice had a falsely friendly tone that made me grit my teeth. "I hope you're not upset about yesterday. It was just business, you understand." "Business," I repeated. "Exactly. Nothing personal. By the way, Mom called last night asking if you're going to Dad's birthday next week. I told her you probably don't have the money for a decent gift, but..." I hung up the phone. In my entire life, I had never hung up on a family member. It was a line I had sworn never to cross, no matter how much they hurt me. But lines are there to be crossed when you finally understand that they only serve to keep you trapped. At 8:30 a.m., I parked in front of Oakwood Trust Bank. Not in the regular parking lot, but in the spot reserved for executive visitors that I had noticed yesterday. Jonathan was waiting for me, along with 2 assistants carrying thick folders. There was also a man I didn't recognize, short, bald, with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the environment. "Brandon, this is Detective Harrison from the Financial Crimes Department," Jonathan said quietly. "Considering the nature of the charges." "I understand," I cut in. There was no turning back now. Marcus saw us coming through the glass of his office. His morning smile turned to confusion when he realized I was accompanied by men in suits carrying official documents. The receptionist directed us to the main conference room. Marcus emerged from his office, clearly trying to project authority. "Can I help you?" he asked, completely ignoring my presence. "Mr. Holloway," Jonathan replied, "I'm Jonathan Crawford, representing the interests of Quantum Dynamics Investment Group. We're here for a compliance audit related to this branch's lending practices." Quantum Dynamics? Marcus frowned. "Never heard of them." "They are the majority owners of Continental Holdings, which controls Meridian Financial Group, which in turn owns Oakwood Trust Bank," Jonathan explained patiently. "In other words, Mr. Holloway, they are your employers." The color drained from Marcus's face like water down a drain. "Impossible," he muttered. This must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," Jonathan continued, opening a folder. "And we have information that there have been significant irregularities in the granting of personal loans, including interest rates that violate federal regulations." It was then that Marcus looked directly at me for the first time. And in those eyes, I saw the exact moment when the pieces fell into place. "You," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You brought them here." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "Brandon, what have you done?" His voice rose an octave. "What the hell have you done?" Jonathan interjected before I could answer. "Mr. Holloway, we need to review all the loan contracts you've processed in the last 12 months. Starting with any loans processed yesterday." If you're following this story of family twists and turns, subscribe to the channel because what happens next will show how a single signature can change a whole life. Marcus staggered back to his chair, his face now completely pale. "Brandon, please, can we talk about this? We're brothers, man. Family." "Family," I repeated, feeling the weight of the word. "Interesting that you mention that now." Detective Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Holloway, did you process a personal loan yesterday with interest rates of 20% in 30 days? There were special circumstances." "What circumstances would justify an effective annual rate of 240%? Marcus looked at me desperately. "Brandon, you can't be serious. This will destroy me." "Marcus," I said calmly, "do you remember what you said yesterday? That I should learn about responsibility." He nodded weakly. "Well," I continued, "consider this your first lesson." In that moment, watching my brother face the real consequences of his actions for the first time in his life, I felt crystal clear clarity. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about ending a pattern that had hurt me for decades. And more importantly, it was about ensuring that people like Mrs. Martha would never again be exploited by people like Marcus. The game had only just begun. "Brandon, for God's sake, you have to stop this," Marcus whispered desperately, his hand shaking as he leafed through the documents Jonathan had spread out on the table. "This will completely destroy me." Detective Harrison was recording everything, his cold eyes cataloging every word that came out of my brother's mouth. Jonathan remained impassive, methodically organizing evidence after evidence. "Mr. Holloway," Jonathan said calmly, "you have processed 43 personal loans in the last 6 months with interest rates that violate federal regulations. This is not an isolated mistake. It is a systematic pattern." Marcus looked at me with pleading eyes. "Brandon, please. We are family. You can't really want to see me in prison." "Family," I repeated, feeling the weight of the word. "It's interesting that you mention that now, Marcus. Do you remember what happened on my 13th birthday?" He blinked, confused. "What?" "Brandon, that has nothing to do with." "You broke my computer," I continued, my voice as calm as glass. You said it was an accident, but I saw you do it on purpose. 3 years of saving. 3 years of mowing lawns and washing cars to buy that machine. That was 20 years ago. And do you know what I did after that? I didn't wait for an answer. I learned how to fix computers. Then I learned how to program. Then I learned about financial systems. All because you broke the only thing I owned. Jonathan intervened, sliding a new folder across the table. Mr. Holloway, I need you to look at this specific document. It's the loan agreement you processed yesterday for a Brandon Holloway. Marcus took the paper, his eyes scanning the lines. Suddenly, his face turned white as a sheet. This signature, he muttered, staring at the document. This signature. It's mine, I confirmed. Brandon M. Holloway. The M is for Matthews. My middle name. But that means, his voice broke. Jonathan opened another folder, revealing a stack of corporate documents. It means that the man you humiliated yesterday for $200 is technically your ultimate employer. Brandon Matthews is the majority controller of Quantum Dynamics, which owns a 67% stake in Continental Holdings. Marcus dropped the paper, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Impossible. You live in that awful apartment. You drive a 2003 Honda. You wear clothes from Walmart. Because I choose to wear clothes from Walmart, I replied. Because I choose to drive a reliable Honda. Because I choose to live simply. But choices, Marcus, are a luxury you've never understood. That was when the conference room door opened. An elegant woman in her 50s entered, her impeccable suit screaming executive authority. It was Catherine Morrison, the regional CEO of Meridian Financial Group. Mr. Matthews, she said, addressing me directly with a respectful bow that made Marcus stagger. I'm so sorry about this incident. We flew in from Chicago as soon as we heard. Marcus looked from me to Catherine, then back to me. Mr. Matthews? She's calling you Mr. Matthews. Brandon Matthews is the pseudonym I use for business, I explained patiently. Quantum Dynamics was registered under that name to maintain privacy. After all, why would I reveal my real identity to a family that has always treated me like a failure? Catherine turned to Marcus, her expression icy. Mr. Holloway, I am officially terminating your employment effective immediately. Security is on its way to escort you off the premises. Wait, Marcus stood up unsteadily, his chair rolling backward. You can't fire me. I've worked here for 7 years. I built this branch. You built a predatory lending scheme, Catherine replied coldly. And you did so while publicly insulting the majority owner of our company. Marcus turned to me, real tears beginning to stream down his face. Brandon, please. My mortgage, my kids. Sarah is pregnant again. We can't afford for me to lose this job. You should have thought about that before you humiliated me for fun, I replied, feeling crystal clear calm. You should have thought about that before you broke federal laws to satisfy your ego. Detective Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, based on the evidence presented here, you are under arrest for violations of the Truth in Lending Act, extortion, and bank fraud. What? Marcus shouted, his voice echoing around the room. You can't arrest me. I didn't know. I didn't know who he was. Your ignorance of Mr. Matthews' identity is irrelevant, the detective replied, pulling out handcuffs. You processed illegal loans for dozens of clients. Your brother's status only gave us the initial tip. As the handcuffs closed around Marcus' wrists, he looked at me with a mixture of horror and utter incomprehension. How? Was all he could whisper. Remember when Dad said I'd never amount to anything? I asked, watching my brother being handcuffed. Remember when you laughed because I chose to study programming instead of playing football? Every insult, every humiliation, every moment you made me feel small. All of it motivated me to become something you could never imagine. Catherine addressed me. Mr. Matthews, how would you like to proceed with the branch? Obviously, we will need new management. Actually, I replied, picking up my phone, I want to make some changes. Jessica, can you come here please? Jessica, the assistant who had processed my loan yesterday, nervously entered the room. Jessica, I said, standing up, did you try to stop Marcus from processing illegal loans? Yes, sir, she replied, looking confused between me and Marcus being escorted out by the guards. "Catherine, I want Jessica promoted to interim manager of this branch. And I want us to implement an interest-free loan program for medical emergencies and essential home repairs. Right away, Mr. Matthews." As Marcus was led from the room, he shouted over his shoulder, "This can't be happening. Brandon, you can't be serious. Not for $200. I paused at the door, turning to look at him one last time. "Marcus," I said calmly, "this was never about $200. It was about 35 years of you treating me like I was nothing. And today you found out that nothing can own everything." As the door closed behind him, I felt something I had never experienced in relation to my family. Peace. But the real storm was just beginning. Because in a few hours, my parents would receive a call from the police station asking why their son was in jail. And after that call, they would ask questions. Questions that would lead to discoveries that would shake the foundations of every assumption they had made about me for decades. The game had completely changed. And for the first time in my life, I was in complete control. The call from the police station came to my parents 3 hours later. I was at Mrs. Martha's house, helping her organize her medications when my phone rang. "Brandon." My mother's voice was broken, desperate. "What have you done? Marcus is in jail, and the police are saying horrible things about illegal loans and something about you owning the bank." I took a few seconds to respond, watching Dona Martha pour tea into her delicate cups. She offered me an encouraging smile, as she always did when she knew I was facing something difficult. "Mom," I said calmly, "I did what I should have done a long time ago. I defended people like Dona Martha from people like Marcus." "People like Marcus? He's your brother." "No," I replied, feeling crystal clear. "Brothers don't humiliate each other for fun. Brothers don't break laws to satisfy their egos. Brothers don't spend their entire lives making you feel inferior." There was silence on the line. Then her voice came back, lower, laden with a guilt I had never heard before. "Brandon, we always knew we favored Marcus. But we never thought you." "What did I, Mom? That I would care? That I would feel something when you treated me like I was a constant disappointment?" "You never said anything." "I did. You just never listened." In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the city like wildfire. The bank manager arrested for predatory lending, exposed by his own brother who turned out to be a billionaire in disguise. The Detroit News ran a front-page story titled "The Invisible Billionaire Who Toppled an Empire of Exploitation." Marcus got 5 years in federal prison. Investigations revealed that he had processed more than 200 illegal loans in the last 3 years, collectively stealing nearly $500,000 in excessive interest from families who could barely pay their basic bills. Most of the victims were people like Dona Martha, seniors on fixed incomes, working families facing medical emergencies, small business owners trying to keep their businesses afloat. Jessica, now the branch manager, implemented my program of interest-free emergency loans. Within 6 months, we had helped 63 families weather temporary financial crises without falling into predatory debt. What surprised me most were the letters. Hundreds of them, from people across the country who had seen the story in the media. Some were from other victims of predatory lending. Others were from people who felt inspired by the story. But the letter that touched me most came from a 17-year-old boy named David from Colorado. "Mr. Holloway," he had written, "my family has always made me feel like I'm a failure because I prefer programming to playing sports. After reading about you, I've decided that I'm going to keep doing what I love, no matter what anyone says. Thank you for showing me that sometimes quiet people are the most powerful." 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I organized a family dinner. Not at my parents' house, where so many painful memories had accumulated, but at my house, the house they had first seen on the day I confronted the whole family about Marcus and Cassandra's behavior. My father arrived first, his shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen before. At 65, Richard Holloway looked like he had aged a decade in a few months. "Brandon," he said, standing in the doorway of my living room, looking around with a mixture of admiration and shame. "This house, it's beautiful." "Thanks. How long have you lived here?" 3 years. He shook his head slowly. 3 years. And we never asked where you lived. We never visited. My mother arrived next, carrying a covered bowl that I recognized as her famous potato salad. Her eyes were red from crying. "I brought your favorite salad," she murmured, as if offering a small tribute of peace. Dinner was quiet at first. 3 people trying to navigate decades of emotional damage with polite conversation about the weather and the food. It was my father who finally broke the ice. "Brandon, I need to tell you something." He put his fork down on the table and looked directly at me. "I failed as a father." "Dad." "No, let me finish." His voice trembled. "For 35 years, I had 2 sons. One I constantly celebrated and one I ignored because he didn't fit my idea of male success. I raised a monster in Marcus and almost lost a genius in you." The tears I had held back for decades finally began to flow. "You're not just a business genius," my mother added, her own voice breaking. "You're a good man. Honest. Everything we tried to teach Marcus, but you learned on your own." We talked until 3 in the morning. It wasn't an instant reconciliation. Some wounds are too deep to heal quickly. But it was a start. A recognition that real family is built on mutual respect, not hierarchies based on insecurity and favoritism. A year later, Mrs. Martha and I were sitting in the community garden I had funded behind the public library. It was a project she had dreamed of for years, a space where neighborhood families could grow their own vegetables and flowers, where children could learn about nature and responsibility. "Brandon, dear," she said, watching a group of children planting sunflower seeds, "do you know what the best part of this whole story was?" "What, Mrs. Martha?" "It wasn't that you proved yourself right about Marcus. It wasn't even that you helped so many families with those interest-free loans." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "It was that you discovered that being underestimated can be the greatest gift anyone can give you." She was right. For decades, I had seen my family's contempt as a mark of personal inadequacy. But in fact, their blindness gave me something infinitely more valuable than approval. It gave me freedom. Freedom to define success on my own terms. Freedom to build wealth without ostentation. Freedom to choose humility over arrogance, substance over appearance. Marcus, even in prison, still doesn't fully understand what happened. In his only letter to me, he wrote, "I still can't believe you did that to me over $200. He never understood that it wasn't about $200. It was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about ensuring that vulnerable people weren't exploited by those in positions of power. It was about breaking a cycle of cruelty that had been perpetuated for generations in our family. Today, at 36, I wake up every morning in a quiet house, drink coffee from a plain mug, and check my investments on a 5-year-old laptop. To any casual observer, I'm still just Brandon, the quiet guy who lives alone and drives a Honda. And that's exactly how I like it. Because I've discovered that true power doesn't come from making other people know how much you're worth. It comes from knowing your own worth and using that knowledge to make the world a slightly better place. Marcus got out of prison last month. I hear he's working at a building supply warehouse in the suburbs, earning minimum wage and living in a 1-bedroom apartment. Some might call that poetic justice. I prefer to think of it as an opportunity for him to learn humility. As for the $200 I borrowed that day, I never paid it back. Technically, it was impossible. The bank had canceled all illegal loans as part of the legal settlement. But every time I see someone being humiliated or underestimated, every time I witness injustice disguised as authority, I am reminded of the power each of us has to change not only our own situation, but the entire system around us. If this story of personal transformation and justice has touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel for more stories about people who refused to accept the role of victim and chose to rewrite their own narratives. And remember, sometimes, the quietest person in the room is also the most powerful. You never know when someone you underestimate may be controlling much more than you realize. The last time I saw Marcus, he was working at the cash register at a gas station. Our eyes met for a moment through the glass. There was no hostility, no vengeful satisfaction on my part. Just a silent acknowledgement that we had both learned lessons we needed to learn. I learned that I deserve respect and I'm not afraid to demand it. He learned that actions have consequences, even when you think you're dealing with someone defenseless. And that perhaps is the most valuable lesson of all. Never underestimate the power of quiet people. Because when we decide to speak, the whole world listens.